Brought to you from the University of Texas at Arlington, this is Charlas Entre Amigos, an initiative of the Edge Center funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Title V Part B POHA grant. I'm your host, Alejandro Ruiz, coordinator of special programs for the Edge Center, and I'd like to welcome you to the first episode of our second season. We're so excited to carry this initiative forward, and we're thankful for your continued listenership and support. We have some amazing guests lined up for you all this season, and we hope you'll tune in to hear their stories. So, ya saben, whether you're a seasoned grad student, a fresh face on campus, joining us online, or just curious about the ins and outs of academia, then this podcast is for you. I'll be your host for this journey through graduate life. To those who are joining us for the first time, a bit of context. The Edge Center stands for Empowerment, Development, and Growth in Education, and that's exactly what we're here to provide you. Located on campus at UT Arlington and Science Hall 322, the Edge Center encompasses a student lounge and private study rooms, career advising, faculty professional development, student scholarships, and so much more. We offer events, resources, support, workshops, and a sense of Comunidad for all graduate students at UTA, helping them thrive academically, personally, and professionally. Now, let's talk about what you can expect from Charlas Entre Amigos. Each episode, we'll tackle a different aspect of graduate life. We'll feature interviews with fellow MAV grads, faculty members, and experts in various fields to give you the advice, insight, and skills you need to succeed. If you'd like to learn more about who we are and what we have to offer, tune in to Season 1, Episode 1 to hear from our wonderful staff, or visit us online at www.uta.edu/hr/edge-center. Mi gente, it's that time again, and I'd like to welcome our very first guest of this new season of Charlas Entre Amigos. She is an assistant professor of practice within the School of Social Work here at UTA, a champion for social justice, an advocate for inclusive excellence, a 2022 Ford Motor Company Mujer Legendaria, and an all-around Chingona. Yeah. It's my pleasure to welcome my colleague, mi amiga, la doctora Jessica Sanchez.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and it's so great to see you.
So happy to have you. I just want to jump right in, Jessica. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your background and your academic journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm very transparent with my identities. I think that's probably why I'm able to make connections so quickly with colleagues, but more importantly, scholars. I don't call students, I call them scholars. That actually came from a professor in my undergrad. He was an African-American professor, political science, and he would always say, "Good morning, scholars." And it really got us in the mood, right? And the power hierarchy was kind of diminished a little bit because he was an academic scholar himself, right? So I always go by scholars. And so with that, I think it's important, my journey is linked right back to my identity and being a biracial Latina from Lincoln, Nebraska. When I tell people where I'm from, they're like, wait, people of color even exist there? And I'm like, yes, I promise you. And, and then I break it down. They're like, oh, that makes so much sense, especially with the Latino population, the migration for farming and land. And so there's a huge Latina population in Nebraska. And same thing for our African-American and Asian identity and representation. So, but with that, my identity has absolutely impacted my educational journey from, my mother is white, my father is Mexican. And so kind of where do I sit at lunch in the cafeteria? I wasn't white enough to sit with the white, the kids, and then I wasn't brown enough to sit with the Mexican kids. And so I was always struggling with this code switching. And it really wasn't until undergrad, that's when I actually had my first Latina professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Dr. Joy Castro, amazing international scholar, publisher, all of that. And that's where I finally felt seen, heard, recognized, someone that has black hair like me, and she was so confident in the way that she took up space. And so she really modeled who I have become as a woman myself. But in that identity, going to a predominantly white institution at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, I remember stepping foot and being back into that K through 12th grade identity of oh my gosh, where do I fit into this huge campus now. And I was so grateful. I found a Latina sorority, Lambda Theta Nu Sorority Incorporated, and I am the oldest, firstborn. And so it was so nice to have sisters that were technically older than me, and like someone was actually guiding me through the process, right? Like maximize on the, resources at this, office on campus, and apply for this scholarship, and let's get involved in community service this way. And so that was a true guiding light for me, right? Like having those essentially older hermanas and like guiding me through that process. But it wasn't until like really graduate school, I would say. I moved away from Nebraska. I knew that Nebraska, near and dear to my heart, but I knew as soon as I could get out, I was leaving. I always wanted a big city. I'm a big city girl. I love to travel. And so I remember in that essence of like, what do I want to do, right? And I had 2 rules growing up from my father. You don't get pregnant out of wedlock, and everyone becomes a doctora.
Okay.
And so, but his, being a high school graduate, his understanding of a doctor was very narrow. Mm-hmm. It was, the people that do surgery on you, the dentist, or a lawyer. And I remember after undergrad, I was like, well, I'm horrible at math and science. And so like going the whole like actual medical doctor route, it didn't even sit right like with my soul and my energy. And then I remember, again, being the first in my family to really pave the way for education, understanding how many years it takes to receive a doctorate, right? So I remember after undergrad, I was like, what can I do? What matches my energy? And I remember looking into human sexuality and sex therapy and sex education. And so I moved out to Philly. I lived there for 3 years. Right before I was starting my PhD journey, I had graduated with my MSW and my MED. And I was like, I want to get closer to home, but like not Nebraska itself. And also I want my career to be in demand, right? As a therapist and as a future at that point, right? Licensed sex therapist. And so I chose Dallas, and my bestie lived here. So it just kind of made sense. And like Dallas is where it feels really good right now in my identity. I've had a little bit, I'm sure that we'll explore into a little bit more, but it feels really good. And in grad school, that's what I was saying, is I think that's where I remember seeing a really powerful quote that we'll talk about a little bit later on, but that really sat with me and really allowed me to flourish in who I am as a woman.
I love it. You definitely touch on the things that we always stress to students. That's finding support, right? Yes. And finding those figures that you can latch onto to help guide you through that journey. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, through that, what ultimately led you to choosing your career in academia?
Yeah, so I, in 3rd grade, I remember Mrs. Janish. We loved her class so much that she took us from 2nd to 3rd grade with her. Like she asked for the same class to teach us 2 years in a row. I know. So we're our own little cohort in like K through 5th grade, right? And she would ask us like, what do you all want to be? And I would tell her, I want to be you. I wanted to be a teacher because I love the way she created this courageous and brave environment for us, and nothing was off limits. We could explore whatever our minds came up with. And I was like, I want to be you. And so fast forward, I saw her randomly on a trip home to Nebraska. I was out, at this sports bar, and I was like, Mrs. Janish. And she's like, Jessica Sanchez, and she's like, what are you doing? And I told her, I was like, well, remember when I told you I was going to be a teacher? I didn't necessarily, as I was in my grad school program and stuff, I was like, I love kids. They're not for me in that realm. But young adults and being in higher education and getting to expand the personal lens, the professional lens, the mentorships opportunities, really like tapping into my inner child, right? Mm-hmm. Like now I get to be the Dr. Castro, like that she was for me, for so many other students at this level. Mm-hmm. And so, being an educator, I've always felt so fulfilled. And being able to provide that support for students, and again, going back to like expanding the way their thought processes think. So higher ed has just always felt right, for sure. Awesome.
I love it. It's definitely very powerful, but I'm sure, the journey wasn't easy to get here. So what challenges did you face along the way, and what would you say was essential to your overcoming them?
Yeah, so I reflect on this a lot because I'm still really good friends with colleagues from grad school, and we will still talk about till this day, Alex. Remember, as grown adults in grad school, we had to ask one another, do you want to be my friend? And like, we laugh about it. Yeah. But like, I don't think people, I think as society, right, we realize like, gosh, like the circle kind of gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you progress in life. And, you know, I've heard people say, you know, you're doing life right if that's what's happening. But then there's other people that need it different, right? They need a lot of people, and that's okay. But I remember being that person that picked up my whole life, moved halfway across the country, and I was like, this is what it feels like to be alone. This is what it feels like to experience touch deprivation, of not getting to just shake someone's hand or hug someone, because I could depend on that for family, right? And friends. And so that was one thing, like, and that's one thing I talk about with my grad students, and even undergrad, but more importantly, grad students, especially the ones that have picked up their lives. And even in this huge state of Texas, picking up your life from San Antonio to Dallas, that's picking up your
huge
life,
change.
right? Yeah. And finding community again. And so I always want to just reiterate that script. Like, that was one of my biggest struggles, was finding community, and then folks that look like me. In my grad program out in Philly, there was only 4 Latinas.
Oh, wow.
No Latinos. And none LGBTQ plus even grad students that identified as Latin A with us. It was just 4 Latinas, and that's what we still talk. And that was one thing that we still talk about. It was like, remember when we literally asked each other at like 20 some years old, like, do you want to be my friend? But there was so much power in being vulnerable, and all of us thinking the same thing and then verbally expressing it, because then we supported each other, right? Like, through and through that 3 years of a dual degree master's program. So that was definitely the number one thing. And then I think number 2 was being again in grad school, and I didn't have any Latin identifying professors. So I had amazing, internationally renowned sex therapists around me, published 1 million books, right? Like, flown out, like talking to celebrities, like these people are sitting in front of me, and also social or powerful social workers, right, on the other side, but no one was brown. And so I remember intentionally when I was going into my PhD, and this is something I talk to grad students about, is I think, you know, when you're navigating the ivory tower, a system that was never designed for individuals like you and I to be here in the first place, the power dynamic is real. Whether, you know, you walk into a space like this, you walk into an academic classroom, every time there's a power dynamic at play, because that's what this whole system was built on. And so I'd like to educate my PhD students that you hold so much power when you are creating your dissertation committee. And a lot of students, we don't educate from the professor lens and empower them that way. We just say, pick your dissertation committee. And the student kind of, you know, they figure it out, but there is so much power. And where I really reclaimed my power in my PhD journey was making sure that my entire dissertation journey was women of color. They weren't necessarily Latina, right? But I was able to actually tap into one alumni from my program who is a social work professor and former Widener grad, and human sexuality, you know, graduate. So she was able to sit on my committee. But I remember saying, like, I was so intentional. I only want women of color because I need them to be able to relate to me in some way, shape, or form. And then I said, and my dissertation chair, amazing, Dr. Pillai, she identifies as Indian American. And I remember telling her, I'm going to write this book, because that's what a dissertation is.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to examine Mexican American women and their sexual subjectivity. So how they experience pleasure, desire, how they contract for safety, how they feel about their bodies and their sexual self-confidence overall. And I said, and we are only going to talk about, for 1 paragraph, I will say that evidence-based research says Latinas do experience high teen pregnancy, HIV rates, STIs, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, but it gets 1 paragraph, because we are so much more than what the majority of academic research says about Latinas' bodies, right? And she was so respectful, and I remember I was just like a hard, rigid boundary. I was like, they're not even getting a whole page, you're getting 5 sentences. Because I'm here to rewrite the narrative around brown bodies for Latinas in academia, right? And so I say that because that was a part of me reclaiming, and also like that reframe of not seeing myself necessarily, right? But making sure I saw myself in other ways.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, hopefully that kind of highlights,
right,
some of the struggles.
It definitely echoes a lot of what I've heard from other students, right? We've had a couple come through the Edge Centers that have moved from California or even from like El Paso, and that struggle to find where you fit in, and that struggle to find your power, right? And how you're piecing together your program or your dissertation committees, all of that. I think you said a lot of good things that our students can resonate with, and I love that. You touched on this a little bit already, but how do you personally engage with and inspire your students, especially those who might be facing those challenges similar to the ones you faced in your journey?
Yeah, I mean, just really holding space. I'm already a licensed therapist, right? So I feel like I'm confident with that skill of being able to create and hold space where someone, can show up as their authentic self and say, Dr. Sanchez, this is what's happening. How do I, what's my next step? And really like seek out that mentorship and guidance. I always say, I think I resonate especially with a lot of graduate students whose parents are immigrants, right? And it's really hard for them. It's like they had this script of like, we moved here for you and a better life and education at the forefront. But then when you get into the education piece, and that's where I'm able to relate a little bit, is where my parents are not immigrants, they both didn't go to college. And so there's this disconnect, and then the guilt and the shame that starts to kind of weigh on our hearts of like, gosh, like I'm trying to make sure that I achieve almost this opportunity that you did not have, that you came here, you sacrificed for me. But then like when they're asking me like, when are you done? Because they don't understand something that they don't know, right? And so I feel like a lot of, Latinx students can struggle with that dynamic of like, I need to be here for the family, and this has been my role, but I'm trying to balance academics, and my professors who possibly don't share that experience or even cultural identity they're not understanding. So just providing that space, one, to let's talk about it, let's process, let's just get it all out, like literally release from the body so it's not so heavy. And then let's talk about advocacy. So empowering them to make sure then that throat chakra is very wide open, or if it's really dim, how are we going to get it so it's bright? And that way they can be their own self-advocate. And so a lot of self-advocacy also comes back to boundaries. So again, as a therapist, being able to really be in my therapy hat with them and say, what's our boundaries with academia and what's our boundaries with family? And how can we get to a healthy medium so you can do both and we don't feel the shame and guilt of having, try to balance the both. So,
of course.
Yeah.
I relate to that. I think I made a realization as you were talking right now that part of my struggle when I first started undergrad in music is that a lot of the professors didn't look like me, and a lot of them didn't understand that the conflicting responsibilities that come with being, Hispanic. I was working through college just to help my mom pay rent when she was living 3 cities away, and a lot of them didn't get that. They would just say, "Oh, just quit your job, you'll be fine." Yeah. It's not that simple.
You're like,
right?
My mom's livelihood also
depends on me.
Yes.
And every little thing, right? Whatever little refund I would get back, I'd send her a chunk of it to help her out. It was hard. And when I switched to something like Spanish, 180, like my professors immediately understood, oh yeah, you're fine. Like whatever we need to do to help you out, we're here. Yeah. So it's interesting to hear that. I'm glad I'm not alone in that.
Right. And I think there needs to be like this entire movement. I had a pretty powerful post the other day on LinkedIn, like literally the first week of school, about a student escaping domestic violence. And it's gone viral for all the right reasons. And I think, right, like how are professors making sure that they're coming from a trauma-informed lens? Because that's what it is. It's trauma-informed care. And it's when a student tells you that this is my experience, it's believing them, it's being flexible with due dates. I mean, if a student, submits now or 2 days late, like what's really the discrepancy here? And so I try to challenge even my colleagues with their thought processes. It's also coming from a decolonizing whole perspective of academia.
Yeah, it's changing the whole system, right? Like you said, it wasn't built for us. So it takes a lot, and it takes very dedicated and passionate people to make that difference. Yeah. I want to touch on that because we're talking about, that power that comes from, being a part of our community. And you've touched a bit on what you've called the reclaiming of the term Chingona. Yeah. So for those that don't know, the word Chingona typically has a negative connotation in the Hispanic community. But there's a hidden power that you found in it. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I through and through, it's the first identity that I share on like my little PowerPoint, whether I'm doing a workshop or I'm with my scholars. And I say, if there's any other Chingonas in the class, and it, again, usually brown students, they start to laugh and be like, woo, yeah, and I get a couple snaps and from time to time. But, you know, I learned about this term, really studied it specifically in my dissertation, because of course I have a whole chapter or a whole section on Chingona. But learning about it, right, with the whole like reframe. So in 2016 is when it was Obama's second term, and you saw this very strong movement of Latinas becoming a lot more politically involved with with getting out to vote. And the advocacy piece. And with that, they reclaimed that term of the Chingona and really it was really reclaimed during the Chicano movement, because when Chicana feminism started, they had to branch off from the Chicano movement because the Chicanas weren't feeling heard, they weren't feeling seen, none of the advocacy was aligning with their bodies and their needs. And so they were already Chingonas then, right? Our ancestors have been Chingonas, always been Chingonas. But so you said, right, like it started in this term of like, oh, the Chingona was the one who did get pregnant out of wedlock, or maybe had multiple boyfriends, or was promiscuous. So these like negative, but also very like oppressive of the controlling of a brown woman's body and her sexuality. And then when it got reclaimed, it was this with that uplift and being involved in voting, like this just powerful term of like, we're going against the grain. We're going with what, you know, Chicana feminists have always been advocating for. We are our ancestors' wildest dreams. You know, we saw that a lot. That was signature from our African-American siblings, and that is their, you know, quote that they really launched, and everyone else, communities of color, were like, oh yeah, that feels great. And so, yeah, it's just something like when I think about the work that I do as a Latina who even talks about sex, talks about human sexuality, advocates in the way that I do, hold people accountable for, you know, violent language that they're using, challenging the system at every chance that I can get, you know, through a decolonizing lens. And it feels good. It feels right. And so every time, you know, when I go home and I'll see my abuelita and I'll have like my Chingona sweatshirt on, just, oh, mija, I don't know why you're wearing that. And I'm just like, I've told you that it means something. And it was so cool because the last time I had worn it around her, my father stepped in and he like advocated for me and was like, Mom, you know, he said, Mom, like, Jessica's already told you multiple times, like, it's not what you, and again, honoring that term was her experience, you know, when she was being raised and into young womanhood and all that and adulthood. But you can tell, right, like the power of language, like she sees it and she doesn't, it's like probably, you know, some forms of like trauma there. Like she remembers, like, if not herself or other women, you know, being referred to that term just because they didn't fall in line with that very Marianismo, machismo, gender dynamic, specifically within the Mexican culture. So yeah, I'm Chingona through and through. I do what I want on my terms, and I feel really empowered with it. And I feel like when I share my story, there's always other Latinas may not walk out and say like, oh yeah, like soy Chingona, like in that moment, they're like, oh, okay. Kind of
start something, you know?
Yeah, and that's the ripple effect.
And I love that because seeing you with your student group, you know, the Chingona's Empowerment Group, it was amazing to see their growth just from that first session to the last one, the confidence that it brings out in them. Yeah. And then that's what it's all about, right?
I know, I need to get on that. They were like, when does that happen? And I was like, oh, yes, I'm out. You'll give me
I love it. Now, I want to pivot a bit because you and I both know that higher education is at a very interesting stage of transition. There's an increased focus on employability and technical skills, or for lack of other words, right, the usefulness of higher ed.
Yeah.
From your perspective, what opportunities do you see for growth and innovation in your field?
Yeah, so when I think of social workers are always going to be a needed area. I think every profession, every major is a needed area. But when I think of social work and what we do, and we de-escalate crisis, we are the policy makers, we are the advocates for historically oppressed and underserved communities. Social workers are always going to exist in every single setting. We're actually like expanding and taking up so much space in settings that we never thought we would. There's a big, just to give a little shout out for veterinary social work that's happening, and like veterinarians realizing, one, they have the highest suicide rates out of any like medical doctor profession, and that research can vary, but they're realizing the power of having a social worker on staff to not only help staff process loss and grief with the high trauma that their jobs require, but then also helping their patients when they lose pets and loved, literally loved family members.
Mm-hmm.
And then also detecting domestic violence. So when animals are coming in and they're abused, and so I'm just like, who knew that social workers would be popping up in veterinary care? Here we are. So when I think of social work, the whole point of the education, right, is obviously learning what you are going to do and how is this field founded, and making sure your social justice lens is in tune with your own morals and values and how you want to advocate moving forward. But when I think of where we're at and the influence of technology, there is still something so sacred about being in person or online, because shout out to our online scholars, because they can be as involved as they want to.
Of course.
And that's what I love. Like, I'm a very engaged online professor myself. But, right, like completing the assignments that are going to challenge your thought process. You may not get that if you just go right into the field.
Yeah.
Your writing skills. Again, AI, love it. I think there's a time and a beautiful place for it, but you have to know how to write a solid professional email or a case note that could possibly get subpoenaed one day because you're a licensed clinician now. And so it's just the power, right? Even the interpersonal connection of being able to have a conversation just like we're doing today. I would not have known you if I didn't come to open house. Actually, if I didn't meet La Jefa at, I was doing a little speaking engagement and she was like, I'm Nancy. And I was like, I'm Jessica. And I'm like, wait, how do I support you? Like, you're doing amazing on campus. And that's what I tell my students too. Like, if you're trying to go into social work and you identify as an introvert, baby, we got to get to a happy medium of like half intro, half extro, because social workers who are successful, we have to have a strong community referral network. When your client's in crisis and they're going to get evicted, where are you putting them? If you have not made those connections, and those start in your classroom, those start in those group projects that a lot of students get annoyed with, and I understand. It starts, with the interactive activities. It starts with the engaged dialogue, even from an online platform, of like the self-recording and getting confident with technology in that realm. And so I think there's just something still so sacred about going, and receiving your undergrad, moving forward into your grad program, if of course that feels right to you, and then hopefully even moving forward into your PhD, again, if it feels right. And so, I think there's so much value to still education, even though I know some of our scholars on campus, I'm like, how much did you make on TikTok last week? And I love that for them, but I love that they're still here because they're telling me, I'm doing great, content creator, but a degree is still something that's meaningful, right?
Yes.
Even though I feel like sometimes, like you said, it can get lost in translation quickly, especially with the influence of social media.
Oh, definitely. No, there's definitely a huge value to it, especially in serving fields,
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I've had a lot of students, even in my online program for education, question if getting the master's is even worth it. But when you start learning about all these different lenses that you can look at problems through and how to better support your students, I think it's super impactful. I've learned so much that I didn't know when I first started.
Yeah. And I think of every major as a helping profession major.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I don't know what major yet actually I don't know. I can't say a major where like you are not interacting with people in some way, shape, or form. Even our scientists, you're part of a team. You have your, however their teams look, but you're still having interacting with people. And I think like there's something to that, right? Of being able to communicate effectively and healthy boundaries and all of it. So
for sure. As a follow-up, I want to know, how are you yourself leveraging these opportunities you talked about, and what impact do you hope to achieve?
Yeah, I would say I'm a huge community connector, no matter what. I think I remember going into grad school and I was like, what is a social worker? I'm just here to be a sex therapist.
Yeah.
And then I fell in love with social work and what it means to be a community connector and an advocate. And so I think that's one thing. Very active on social media, but I'm very intentional about learning. I live in Dallas, so what is my community? What is the history here? Who can I help out, and vice versa? How can I partner with folks, right? Because again, having that extensive referral, and of course I'm a business owner, so also have to be able to network. But yeah, I love that community connector piece. And then what was your second part you said?
What level of impact do you hope to achieve?
Ooh, that's a great question. So I think it goes back to when I think of level of impact, I just saw something so powerful the other day, of course, on social media. And it said, you know, when you pass on your gravestone, it's just a dash between the year you were born and the year that you are, you know, that you've moved on. And his whole point was, you don't see a list of accomplishments. And so he was like, so do it. What are you waiting on? And I was like, thank you. I don't know why I needed that today, but I guess I needed that for something. Like, my body totally needed that on some things that I've been hesitant with my, you know, business and moving forward. And so I share that because it was just powerful, right? Of like, don't wait, just do it. If it feels right, like, what do you have to lose? Okay, you fail, so maybe you decide to do it again a different way and it works, or you just scratch it off the list in entirety. So just take the chances and always believe, you know, take the chance on yourself. You deserve that. But I think the one thing when I think of this, I'm like, I don't know, like, I want to impact as many lives, right, as possible, of course. I want to change so many different scripts in academia, in the therapy world. But what I think about and what makes me feel good right now, where I'm at in this season of life and all that I have accomplished to date, was when I was in grad school, I saw a really powerful quote, and it said, be who you needed when you were younger. And that has always stuck with me. If you sit in a workshop of mine, it's what I end every single presentation with. And I remember in grad school seeing that, and I have become exactly the woman that I needed when I was inner child's younger Jessica. And so that has made me feel so confident in who I am. And when the achievements come and the recognition, great, love it. Next project. Like, how can I do more? And so I share that because I feel like anyone, and it doesn't have to matter what age you are, you can become who you needed. And when I became that person, all of my decisions that I make, they feel so good. They feel so genuine. I do it with a lot of confidence. And so that feels good. So I'm like, level of impact, I want to do everything. I know I can't do everything, but I know that I'm confident with who I am. So, you know, the decisions that I make, they always feel good.
The rest will flow, right?
Exactly. Yes.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing and for being vulnerable with us. You truly are an inspiration to nuestra gente.
You are too.
So I want to end on a positive note. What advice would you give to any aspiring or current graduate students who may be struggling to bridge the gaps between their experiences, identities, and passions?
That you deserve to take up space, period. That you deserve to be here if you feel that there's a disconnect in the academic world and, you know, your reality. That you deserve every opportunity that comes your way. And when imposter syndrome creeps in, just know, I mean, I could get really deep with that. That's your brain coming from a colonized thought process, but that's okay. And what can you do to start really getting comfortable with, like, I do deserve this opportunity. And so seek out mentorship. Mentorship is so important. Get yourself a therapist. You do not have to be in crisis to have a therapist on your team. Therapists are there to remain unbiased, neutral, and just support you in that moment. And just continue to always choose you. I think that's so hard for our brown scholars because, again, that dynamic, especially, you know, if parents are immigrants and the first generation and, you know, constantly trying to be like, I have to choose family today over myself. It can be really hard for a student to get to that level of being okay with being selfish. And even that word, sometimes it's so hard for even my clients to say out loud.
Oh, yeah.
Especially my Latina clients. But when I get them to a point of being able to say it with confidence and them realizing if I'm not doing okay, my family's not doing okay.
Yeah.
I have to pour into me first in order to be able to pour into others.
Of course.
And rewriting that script just for everyone, but specifically to our Latina scholars, that we don't necessarily get told to choose ourselves the moment we come out and we're introduced to the world. So either way, just choose yourself. And again, I can't stress the importance of mentorship. Reach out to Alex.
Thank you. Shameless plug.
Yes, we are here to support.
For sure. Thank you so much again for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you on the show, and we're excited to see all the great work you'll continue to do in our community.
Oh, thank you so much for the invite and sharing space and energy.
Of course. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Charlas Entre Amigos. Join us on October 25th as we sit down with the future Dr. David Reynoso. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on all things Charlas Entre Amigos. Remember, whether you're a current graduate student or just curious about graduate life, We're here to support you every step of the way. Until next time, mi gente.